panelists for category women. So we really appreciate all of you being here, and I'm really excited to be the moderator for this panel. Do we have any questions? Who would like to start? Perfect. We're just going to bring the mic to you.
Hi. It's always interesting to find out for both sides, like a male look like more like female, or female look like a male. You know, it's hormone story sometimes, but we have to admit that the black people, they have advantage maybe because they are from Africa, and when they grow up, they always go and run and run and run, and it sounds like they develop faster, like if you look at like a cat, you will probably figure out a cheetah is the fastest cat in the whole world than another cat. And I don't know if you want to get involved in that story, maybe only the European should be compete with European, or maybe just African should compete with African. I don't know. What is the right answer for both sides?
Payoshni, do you want to take this?
I could, being in Vancouver, I could just say, what you suggested is absolutely the wrong answer. Categorically, the wrong answer. Thank you.
May I speak to that? I think there's an assumption that, you know, most people in common sense, you know, they think that men and women are two categories that are discretely different. And I mean, that same view of a fixed sex binary that, you know, is always how it's going to be, it's really linked to similar binaries about racial difference and the kinds of attitudes that underscore really racist attitudes about, you know, who has natural athletic ability. Like, it's all kind of mixed up into the same pot. I want to talk about the film for a moment. I do a lot of research in this area, and I've seen a lot of media on the topic of sex testing, and I read a lot. And I just want to commend the filmmakers and everyone who participated in making that film. It's one of the most powerful treatments of the topic matter that I've seen. And one of the things that I found so refreshing is it was so grounded in the experiences of the women who were most harshly targeted for it. And I think that's what makes it really unique. And it's a really important contribution to make us think about the complexity of human variation and to, you know, take all our taken for granted beliefs about how people are different from each other and be very cynical and skeptical about them, because they're linked to long-standing relations of power and exclusion. But again, it's a beautiful, powerful film, and I really appreciated it. I look forward to using it in my classrooms in the future. It's just a stunning film.
Payoshni, can you speak to that, what the audience members said? Thank you very much, Dr. Travers. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Phyllis, and thank you, everyone, for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm a bit, I wasn't expecting this question, to be fair. I wasn't expecting a question about advantages that an African athlete might have, you know, in 2023. But there are surprises, and I think it just sort of in some way emphasizes the need or, you know, the importance of this film, really. And I think it's important also the fact that we constantly talk about these regulations, and often the sport governing bodies talk about these regulations and say it has got nothing to do with race. and it has got nothing to do with geographical location. And I think the question that came today, the very first question, emphasizes how important it is to sort of connect these two issues, these regulations that are made, and the questions and the assumptions and the that we have still, and I think it's important. This film does sort of make sure that the athlete voices are heard very, very much. And if we look at who make these policies and regulations, we would see that the group of people who are deciding the fate of these women in some way are very European and very North American sometimes as well. And there has been very little decision-making power that came to women from Africa and Asia and South America as well. I haven't worked so much in South America, but from the global South, and I think it's really sort of telling. The question that came today, the first question, it tells me a lot more than what I can respond in as a response to the question. I can't say anything more. Thank you.
Thank you, Payoshni. Is there anyone else that would have any comments before we move on to the next question from the panel? Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Is there another question? Yes, we have a couple at the back. So I see the first, very, very back there. We've got the mic coming to you.
Thank you. So, ever since I entered university, I've always had this interest in this categorization and just this big assumption that women's sports is like less than men's sport. And in university, I've always wanted to look into this problem more and just learn more about it. And I feel like I haven't really had the opportunity to find a class that really focuses on sports. So I guess my question would be as a university student, what could I do to contribute to combating this big assumption, this big universal assumption, as for right now and maybe in the future when I start working?
Thank you for that question.
I teach a course on sociology of sport at SFU, but I also integrate this discussion into courses I teach on, trans issues and gender issues as well. And I think it's really unfortunate that you haven't had the opportunity to learn more about it. But the information is out there. You just have to dig. The most important thing the takeaway is that the so-called science of sex difference, the science of racial difference, etc., those are not scientific at all. And they're defended by people who run institutions as if they were scientific, but they're not. So I think that, just carrying yourself with critical awareness and, asking questions about things that people say, taken for granted assumptions and beliefs is a really important way to interrupt, just even the people around you who take these things for granted because we're literally fed them, from birth. And you actually have to go out of your way to learn, what's actually true.
I think it's wonderful that at the age of education that you're inquiring and asking this question. So thank you for your curiosity in this space. I mean, I'll be 64 soon, and I'm still learning. But the most important thing is that we remain allies. And that word, I've certainly learned. I thought I knew what solidarity meant, and I thought I knew what, being a good ally is. And Payoshni certainly was a great teacher, in that space, because she does it so naturally. And So I think it's really wonderful that you asked that question. So that's a really great starting place for you to then, begin your search, and it makes me feel great that you probably share that with other people, and moving into your sort of your work life as well. So thank you.
Thank you for that question, because I think you're one step ahead already by watching this film and wanting to learn more and do more. And as Phyllis just pointed out, I think the important alliances that we were able to create through the last more than a decade now of this work were crucial to the little bit of things that we were able to achieve. Now, we haven't been able to achieve a lot. There are women suffering. We don't know of many of them. All of that is true, but the fact that we have still been able to reach some of these athletes, they are willing to speak. They have the information today that there are some athletes like Caster Semenya fighting cases at the Court of Arbitration for Sport or the European Court of Human Rights, that there is nothing wrong about them. For the longest time, when I used to sort of reach out to many of the athletes I've worked with, they would say, I have a problem. And it took me a lot of time to explain to them that this is not a problem, and for them, they were sort of made to understand and believe that they had a problem. So I think it's you're already one step ahead, and you're there already, wanting to do something or wanting to learn more. You're always welcome to reach out to us, I think, and to me as well, because I continue to do this work, even though there's a lot of resistance nowadays than we used to have earlier. But you're most welcome to reach out if you want to do something actively as well. Thank you.
First and foremost, I wanted to say thank you for the delicacy with which you treated people from the African continent. Typically in media images, you just don't see, people being presented in their full humanity, which is something I thought you guys captured well, having lived in Nairobi, seeing Gong Hills and Rift Valley, as well as being South African and having followed the Caster Semenya story for a very long time. I think one of the things you did really well with the film was to make this a global issue, because as a South African, it's always felt very localized. Like, once again, South Africa facing racism in the world, which is something we're very well accustomed to, and having the instruments of how to fight against global racism, having won apartheid. But I think this is a different fight. And I'm curious how this fight links to the wider trans identity fight, because I thought a very powerful racial lens was introduced in the film, but we didn't go quite deep into the queerness and how it's linked to trans. So yeah, I'd just love to hear you guys speak about that. So that's question one. Question two is, what's happening now with the legislations and sports governing bodies? Where is Caster's case? Yeah, because the last statement of the film was from 2021, if I'm not mistaken. It's now early 2023. What's changed and what hasn't?
Is there someone that would like to start?
I can take the second question, because the first question is related to how the film treated a certain subject. I can take both, but I would prefer to take the second one, if that's okay.
Do you want me to start with the first one, or do you want to just go ahead with the second one? Okay, thank you. I'm really glad you asked that question, because the assumption that there are men and women and anyone who is sort of in between is like deviant, a birth defect or something like that. It's deeply related to the experiences of trans people. I think for example, if we had like a much broader view of gender and we understood gender as a spectrum, because in reality, sex is a spectrum, that, I don't think it would be such an incredibly difficult fight for trans people to be fully included in public life. One of the ways in which trans people have been excluded has been by labeling us freaks of nature, and encouraging people to be actually disgusted by trans people. And the same kind of hatred towards people who are intersex or gender nonconforming in some way, it's all very tied together. I think that the film was so powerful in bringing the appropriate lens of understanding race as a social force in shaping this. But it's really interesting if you look at trans politics around athletic inclusion too. There's a lot of, like, I'm very uncomfortable with some of the trans people who talk about what should happen with sport. I'm thinking of Joanna Harper, for example, who is a trans woman and very involved in policy debates about inclusion. And her argument is that it makes sense that there are more athletes from Africa with so-called disorders of sex development. And I hate to repeat this, it's so racist, but she's making the argument that there's more intermarriage. It's a more primitive context. And I mean, when I read her work, I was like, it's horrific. But what I appreciate about it is there's no denying it. It's so foundationally white supremacist. So, you have to look at trans politics as well. And there's a lot of acknowledgement of, intersectionality among a lot of trans activists. But there are some trans people who are pushing for policies who, have very, very limited views of sex and gender that are very shaped by racism. So it's a really important conversation to have. So I appreciate you asking that question.
I don't know if would anyone on the floor like to contribute before I start?
I want to hear from you.
I think we'd love to hear from you, Phyllis.
I think when you think about sport and we think about harm, which we are talking about a lot, Payoshni, and when we're looking at safe, the word inclusion is part of that. When we think about, how do we create and not do harm. And Payoshni, we were thinking, I was saying, we need a hashtag for something that we're doing. And she said, all women in. And it really had a lot of impact on me when we say that. When we look at the women in the film, somebody yelled at me at a Q&A once. I was by myself. I didn't have any of this wonderful support of other people on the panel. And he yelled at me and he said, you didn't identify the athletes, you didn't identify, you didn't. And I said, every individual identifies themselves and every athlete identifies how they identify. And the women in the film chose to articulate who they are and how they are and the way that each individual in the film identifies as a woman. And when we, so that's this film. And I do appreciate, the conversation around there were misrepresentation of differences in sex development, and when that's this film, and for the trans inclusion conversation, that is an extraordinarily important conversation, and someone will make an extraordinarily important film, I'm sure, in the very near future, in this space. This film covers the particular women in our film, in their focus. I had an opportunity actually to interview Joanna Harper for this film, and you will notice she's not in the film.
Thanks, Phyllis. Payoshni, do you want to take that second question?
Yes, adding to what has been said about Joanna Harper, I do know her personally, having worked in this area for so long, having sat in those court cases where obviously Joanna was on the other side, and I on the side of Caster Semenya or Duti Chand. I think what we didn't mention, we're talking about African athletes in particular in most cases here because of, I think, the lengthier sort of time that has been dedicated to some of the African athletes, but also Duti Chand was interviewed, who is from Asia. And it's a question I have often received when I've spoken in Africa is it an African issue? And it is not either. It's very universal. I think that the fact we were talking about the connections with the trans inclusion debate, which is very sort of big at this moment in North America, but it's also important to have these stories as well, which are often overshadowed because of the concerns of certain groups in the global north. So I really appreciate the sort of the emphasis on the stories of these women from the global south in this film. Having said that, I wanted to add this about Joanna, that when 10 years later, after Caster Semenya's Berlin victory at the World Championship, where she was sort of under scrutiny, very sort of very shoddily sort of handled case, the Times wrote an article. The Times in London wrote an article about the 10 years since Berlin World Championship. And I was interviewed for that article, so was Joanna Harper. And Joanna said something about Caster, which was quite telling. And that is, if her case was not leaked, she would be one of those women who disappeared. And that has been, that's quite something that she said, which tells you what these people who have been part of these working commissions, medical commissions, or in these regulations really believe. That if Caster Semenya's case wasn't leaked, she would have been disappeared. And it's the word that was also used when we were sitting at these sort of court cases, disappeared athletes. And Annet Negesa, whom you heard, and I think she's in Berlin, so she's not, it's middle of the night for both of us, really. She's not, probably that's why in the panel she was supposed to join. And, Annet, according to the IAAF and their allies, was one of these disappeared women. Athletes, don't disappear like that. So I just wanted to mention that about Joanna since she has been discussed here. To answer the second question, what stage is Caster Semenya in with her case at the European Court of Human Rights? The last, I think, the public statement that was made by the court was about the intervention that could be made from different related parties, and there, I am aware of some interventions from Human Rights Watch, and some of us who co-wrote that report, Dr. Katrina Prince, who you have heard in this film, and myself. We submitted an intervention. There are other people, I'm sure, from both sides who had submitted intervention, who are supposedly either experts in the issue or have an interest in the issue, or so there were these interventions made, following which there was no hearing that has happened so far as I know. However, we were expecting something early this year. We were expecting to hear something early this year, which still hasn't happened, but hopefully sometime. That's all we can say, because there hasn't been any more information which is public. But I don't think also the legal team and Caster herself has been informed much about the European Court of Human Rights. So that's the problem which you are talking about. If the film might have been shot in 2021, but the justice system takes so long. We say that thing that justice, if justice delayed is justice denied. We are talking about athletes who are active. They have this short a life, and they're waiting and waiting. And it's not only Caster who's waiting for this judgment. There's so many of them, as you see, even Gillian McKenna, suffering so much and waiting, relying on the European Court of Human Rights to come up with a judgment that would help their lives. And they are waiting for years. And several of them are giving up. It's not easy to switch events and be successful. Most of them haven't been able to switch events from the non-restricted ones to, from the restricted ones to the non-restricted ones, and have been successful. If you are a middle distance runner, it's not so easy to move to longer distance or sprint events. So most of them are not successful, and they're giving up. And we are waiting and waiting for our courts to give a judgment, while real lives are being affected. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Would you like to say?
I wanted to say that I really appreciate your question and your comments, because it's something that popped into my mind as I was watching the film as well. And the response in my mind that popped back when I thought about some of these things is very similar to the one that that Phyllis ended up saying as well, which is one film, right? And it's hard to do everything in one film and maintain a focus. And I haven't sent this yet. The film it blew me away. It was fantastic, and I like films that make me think and make me do lots and lots of research, and this was certainly one of them. And also made me feel, because what came across was very much the fact that nobody should be subjected to this type of medical invasion. If they're not ill, and they're not ill, right? And just the inhumanity of what the Athletic Federation, the IAF, or now World Athletics, is doing. But I do want to say that I also think there is room, as we ponder, the implications of this film, that there's also, room to recognize that. I guess the importance of recognizing the violence that a presumed gender binary can do, because we have this in very this is where it's really in evidence, where the Athletic Federation is trying to impose something that is not a reflection of who humanity is, and I also think there's possibilities to make room for people who identify as non-binary, right? And to recognize their humanity. One thing that worries me is the idea that a condition of being human is to have a binary gender, right? To identify as a woman or a man, and that's somehow presumed to be, if you're not a woman or a man, then you are not human. And I think that we need to unpack that and realize that we are humans, right? And people, this is not to say that a woman who feels like whose identity is a woman, that should be questioned. It should not. Absolutely, there are people who identify as women. There are people who identify as men. There are people who identify as non-binary. There's people who identify as any one of the infinite points between and beyond. So yeah, I do want to say that it's very important to recognize that one does not have to identify as a woman or a man to be a human being. And I would like to see our systems make more room for that. And the other thing I would want to say is, and it speaks to the idea of allyship, it's also really important that we not sort of get into the weeds of, trans versus something else, right? We are all actually fighting the same fight against this imposition of this artificial gender binary that doesn't, again, reflect the full reality of who human beings are.
If I can just add something to that, I mean, the history is really important. The notion of civilization was completely linked to patriarchy. And European colonizers who encountered societies that had more egalitarian gender systems or had non-binary gender systems, that was evidence of their primitiveness and therefore their complete lack of humanity. And hence, their land was taken, they were killed or abused, genocide, etc. I mean, it's all linked. And I think one of the things that really comes through, and sport is really important in this regard, in order to uphold a sex binary system, you have to, and I'm thinking, Dr. Mitra, I like the language you used, you have to disappear evidence that betrays that it's not a reality. And the entire system of sport is set up to hide the tremendous overlap between so-called male and female athletic performances. And there's a long history in Canada and the United States of surgically altering intersex babies, not for medical reasons, but for adult comfort. So there's this long-standing effort to make people who don't conform to the sex binary to disappear them in so many different ways. And we certainly see that this has been the case with athletes who so-called flunk a completely unscientific gender test to portray them as pathological, but even better, to just make them go away without explanation. So there's a long history of disappearing evidence that contravenes the idea of a sex binary.
When I was an athlete, we were sex tested. I don't know how many times. It was sex testing, gender testing, femme testing, femininity testing. And then we would get a femme card. If you saw one, my friend, who was actually here this afternoon, her femme card's in the film. And what they did, if you failed, many things, but often they'd put a cast on your leg and send you home with an injury. And it's not like everyone didn't know, you'd come from the gender verification lab or whatever, and then, 2 hours later, an athlete would come with a cast on her leg and would be sent home because she, hurt herself or whatever. the modern Olympics was based, they didn't want women to compete. Then they were afraid of male masqueraders and this sort of deep underlying misogyny that Payoshni talked about, and just with reference to the white male gaze on women's bodies and policing women's bodies for almost 90 years now in sport in various ways. Only women identified athletes. So bodily autonomy goes hand in hand with safe sport and with inclusion. So that's, but I do want to say that my lived experience and my point of view, whatever, abuse of power, sexual assault, psychological and other abuse that we all incurred as athletes at some point. My lived experience as a privileged white woman that, from the global north, pales by comparison. Not just discounting my lived experience, and it contributes to a conversation. But it's, it's not, having been experienced and gotten to know some of the women. But really what I wanted to say is it's not just World Athletics, and Payoshni could certainly speak to that, it's other sports. FIFA, women's soccer, women's football, swimming, and it just infiltrates into so many other sports that we think it's isolated to one sport, and it isn't. So a lot of work to do. Not my work, but Dr. Mitra is and the people that are doing the hard work. The work that they do, it's easy to make a film, it's hard to do the work.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes, we have one here.
Thank you for a wonderful film that was really eye-opening. I didn't even know this would even exist, so I'm glad. Thank you for producing it, because why wouldn't men, right, be tested? And if there's a cap-off level, they'd be disqualified. So it just doesn't make sense. But what I wanted to know is, in the past, when I was growing up and watching athletes compete on TV, I remember testosterone testing, and some women were injecting. So how do they tell the difference between that and natural women testosterone levels? And the other question I had is, when they made that very unfair decision to remove athletes from being able to compete with the high testosterone level, did that Indian woman lose her prize then? Because, her levels were higher, which would be appalling to me. But that was my question, if this board is making all these decisions.
Payoshni, would that be something
The
you'd like to
second part, okay, the second part, or I'll answer the second part because that's about Duti Chand. I was part of her case. I had a power of attorney in her case, in fact. So I have the right to speak on her behalf in some way. She wasn't, no, her medals were with her medals were not withdrawn. Shanti Soundarajan from 2006 Asian Games, though, her medal was withdrawn. I believe you're asking about Duti Chand here, not Shanti Soundarajan. No, Duti Chand was dropped, and then by that time, some of us were already connected. Dr. Kurkazes, as I mentioned, Professor Bruce Kidd from Canada, and myself, we were already connected in 2013 2014, and we got in touch with each other, and we wrote to the Indian. They wrote to the Indian government. I went personally to the Indian government, and sort of we started, working on with the athlete directly. I went to do this village as well. So we intervened quite quickly, and we went to court of arbitration for sport. There was no talks about dropping, of withdrawing any of her medals, because the World Athletics' hyperandrogenism regulations didn't really say that. But we also took action quite quickly. There were questions were raised at that time initially, but then there was no proof. So what is again important, and I think this has been mentioned already, that the science has never been clear. In the case which we had in Lausanne at the CAS, at the Court of Arbitration for Sport, in 2015, when the hearing happened for Dutee Chand's case, Professor Aina Youngfest, who has been a medical commission chair for the IOC and also part of the IAAF medical commission for many years, he was asked a few questions about the history of sex testing, and he admitted that it's a history of ignorance. And history of ignorance, because the science has never been clear. They came up with some kind of science, then they had some kind of a policy. Soon after, they realized that it's not really, some athlete's case would happen and they would realize that it's not good enough. Then they would start working on a fresh one. And that has been the history of sex testing, just causing harm to athletes one after another, but not really having real science to back all these regulations and the need for these regulations. Yes, there was no sort of no medals were withdrawn because there was no science that they could offer to the court that in sprint events there could be some advantage because of higher level of testosterone. There was no evidence. We were having this conversation at the court in 2015. The hyperandrogenism regulations of the World Athletics, at that time called the International Association for Athletics Federations, came into place in 2011 for 4 years. And in those 4 years, Annet Negesa happened. I mean, all that she went through was from 2011 or 2012 onwards, right? So World Athletics was dealing with all these cases, and I shouldn't say case, they're real humans, and they were affecting their lives the way you have seen in this film. Well, their science was not clear. They couldn't, even though they brought in all their scientists who were often apparently very well known and well established, they could not establish, they could not really back their regulation with science in 2015 at the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And I think it's really important to see how these regulations are then coming into place. They are because these people who are in this medical commission have their own biases. They sit in their own bubble and work on these policies. And I've always felt that whenever I travel from India to Lausanne, that how different our worlds are. I've been to the village of Dutee Chand. I've also been to Lausanne, and sat there. Now I'm working in Lausanne, but you see the difference. You see how somebody was talking about in the very first question about the advantage of African athletes. I mean, the socio-economic element here is completely missed. Our athletes don't start at the same place as your athletes, if that makes any sense. I'm not sure if I really answered the question that was asked, but I believe as far as Dutee Chand is concerned, I did. I probably forgot the first part of the question. If you want, if you remind me, maybe I can. Go ahead. Thank you.
I can speak to, I'm not a sports scientist, but I am an athlete and have been sex tested, and I have also been doped. So from what I know, and in speaking with experts, epidemiologists, and doctors that have been working in this space for a very long time, the level of naturally occurring testosterone, there really isn't any measurement of what is too high and too low. For naturally occurring testosterone, that is measured through a blood test. Now, the way that these women are targeted it happens in several different ways, and I'll tell you two quick stories. One is your fellow athletes can, as it happened with Miss Semenya, the athletes and coaches, complain, and this is their words, she's a man, just look at her. Maria Savinova, I believe her name is, the Russian athlete who complained profusely, profoundly at the World Championships when Caster was so horribly treated. Then in 2012 in London, she won the gold medal and Caster won silver. And she was tested for doping. And her blood was taken, and in her blood was an anabolic steroid, and her medal was stripped after she had complained about Caster Semenya, whose naturally occurring testosterone is not deemed a performance advantage any more than Michael Phelps' wingspan or Taco's, one of the big tall basketball players' heights. So what happens when you're sex tested? It was a buccal smear, I think, when I got tested. By that point, I've been also physically tested. But what people don't understand when you are blood doped, when you have to go in and get your blood taken, or your urine, it starts with a urine sample. So when you go into the room, it's a cubicle, and you sit down and you have to be naked from your breasts down. So you take your clothes off, and there's a person that's monitoring you, and you go in and you take your clothes off, and you have to urinate in the toilet with someone staring right at you, very close to your body, and they're staring at you, and they're staring at your body, and they're looking right at your genitalia, and they see you in full view, and they watch you urinate because. There have been cases, certainly over the time, through WADA has identified athletes try and sneak other people's urine because they're using anabolic steroids or other kinds of steroids. So they watch you go to the washroom and they watch your body. And then what happens, sometimes if someone sees something that maybe they identify as something that looks different than what you see in a book of what anatomically a woman's body looks like, they go and they whisper that to somebody out in the other room, and they say, I looked at Phyllis and something's not quite right down there. You might want to do a blood test. So if my urine is clean, there is no need to do an additional blood test on me if I'm clean. But if someone doesn't look like, so it's the visual interpretation of what I look like, and then someone says you might want to check Phyllis's something's not right, and then they call me back in. My urine is clean. I'm not taking anabolic steroids. And then all of a sudden I'm called into a room and I've got to get my blood test taken. And then all of a sudden my natural level of testosterone, which can be higher and lower depending on the time of day, depending on whether you've worked out, depending if you're in menses, depending on a lot of different things, your level of testosterone can go up and down throughout the day. So that's the difference. Is anabolic steroids is something foreign you put in your body because you're trying to cheat. Naturally occurring testosterone is how you are born, and it's no more of an advantage than. And you know what? Olympians are phenoms. And that's why they're Olympians, because they have something extra special. Extraordinary lung capacity, extraordinary height, fast twitch fibers, incredible mental acuity and mental capacity. And this identified, targeted testosterone, high level of testosterone, is just based on fear-mongering, period. And misogyny. And racism.
Thank you so much. That's all the time we have. I really want to thank you once again. Phyllis, thank you so much for sharing your own experience with us this evening, as well as taking that experience and then centering the voices of the women we heard from today, and to create this film for us to learn more so we can make change. Payoshni, thank you so much for all that you do to represent these athletes and to center their voices and to bring those voices forward. Dr. Travis and Dr. Kozak, thank you so much for all that you folks do in your universities, teaching the students that you work with and teaching your fellow colleagues. And I know that goes beyond what both of you do, so thank you so much. And also